How we doing, brewers? Welcome back to Dudes Brews. Today we're going to be breaking down Pomona Yeast from Lallemand. It's a brand new strain that's been specifically bred for use in hazy IPAs and pale ales. I'm going to cover its origins and the development process for this yeast, what makes it unique, how best to use it in the brew house, and my own experience of working with it in a double IPA that I've made. So grab yourself a cold one and let's get into it. Let's start with the big question, where does Pomona come from? So Lallemand have created this strain by selectively breeding two parent yeasts, Sterling and Cerberus. So Sterling is a Scottish-British strain which has a really clean, efficient fermentation profile and low aroma production, perfect for reliable, consistent brewing. On the other hand, Cerberus is a diastatic saison type strain, which means it's got the STA1 gene. That was chosen for high aromatic properties, the biotransformative potential, and also a highly attenuative and fairly fast kind of fermentation profile, with the caveat that being a saison strain, that diastatic nature might mean that it's prone to over-attenuation. So after producing various hybrids from those two strains, the best one was selected, and it then took 48 generations of adaptive evolution to arrive at the final Pomona strain. So that was done using high gravity hazy IPA wort so that the yeast would be optimized for those kind of brewing conditions. Each generation being screened for the best combination of haze stability, efficiency and biotransformation potential. You can learn a whole load more about this in the links below, some of which are from Lallemand themselves. And also, if you go and check out the Hop Edition episode 105, you can see us talking to Alex and Andrew from Lallemand Yeast about this strain specifically, while we actually taste a bunch of beers that we made using it, including the double IPA that I'm going to show you shortly. So the final hybrid yeast contains the best of both worlds, effectively. You've got the kind of clean, reliable fermentation from Sterling with very low off-flavour potential or production of off-flavour precursors. From the Cerberus, you've got that aromatic profile, biotransformation potential, and it's also pushing the attenuation and speed of fermentation in the final strain a bit higher. But with the diastatic STA1 gene now bred out of the yeast. So let's have a look at the brewing specs for this yeast. As you can see, Pomona should be a great choice for a wide range of hazy style beers, and with a very high attenuation and alcohol tolerance, it will obviously suit higher gravity beers like your DIPAs and TIPAs particularly well. So one thing you might be asking yourself is, why did Lallemand introduce this strain when they've already got New England and Verdant yeast in their lineup, specifically geared towards hazy styles? And the short answer is basically more diversity. So there's lots of variety in terms of like hazy beer yeast that are coming out at the moment, and Lallemand want to basically offer an additional option that's going to give you a different flavour profile to those existing strains. According to Lallemand, it is particularly robust and reliable. So as we saw looking at the specs, it definitely seems like it's being geared also towards the higher gravity end of the market in terms of your IPAs, as far as double IPAs and triple IPAs, where those kind of beers might prove slightly more challenging in terms of brewing conditions for other yeasts. It also looks like, in terms of turnaround time, the fermentation length may be a bit shorter with this yeast as well. Again, on paper, looking at some of the information from Lallemand related to the biotransformation properties of this yeast, it should have a distinctive profile in that sense, with a higher potential for transforming terpenes compared to some of those other yeasts that we've mentioned. Again, links to all that information in the description, so go and check those out if you want to find more details for yourself. I think, again, looking at the potential fermentation speed with this yeast, Lallemand are maybe trying to close the gap a little bit to some of the quite derived strains that have been released recently, but without using an actual Quake strain as an isolate in this case. So let's get on to my experience of brewing this double IPA that you can see here with Pomona yeast, obviously. I brewed this using Mosaic, Strata, and Nectaron hops, and in that I was using Mosaic, Incognito, and Spectrum. So it is a pretty heavily hopped beer, definitely pushing the limits in terms of the hopping rate that I would typically use, but it is a double IPA, so it's coming just short of 8%. And yeah, I guess I was looking for a beer to test it with, which was up in that higher kind of gravity range that it's supposed to be good for. You can see a link to the full recipe for this beer in the description, and I'll put a little overview of the kind of key numbers for this one on the screen now. So I must say, one thing that I definitely did notice with this yeast was the impressive fermentation performance. So it was looking like it was pretty much done within about 3 to 4 days, which, considering it was a double IPA, is pretty fast. That's definitely getting more towards what I would expect to see with Quake isolate strains, like some of the stuff that I've tested from WHC recently, as opposed to a more traditional ale yeast. And it was definitely at confirmed final gravity by day sort of 5 to 6. I didn't notice any obvious kind of off flavour production during the fermentation, and it was sort of conditioned and ready to drink pretty much almost as soon as I'd kegged it. So there wasn't any waiting around trying to, let slightly dodgy flavours that you might see sometimes in very quick fermentations, waiting for those to dissipate or whatever. So it seems to be a characterful yeast, but one that does give you fast but relatively clean in terms of off flavours fermentation. So that's all great, but what about the all-important sensory experience with this beer? I'm really pleased with it, I've got to say. This got some really good feedback from people that I've sent it to. It got some really good feedback on the podcast, including from the two guys from Lallemand, which is obviously really pleasing to hear that from the people who produced the yeast itself. And it's basically a really super juicy, mega tropical kind of double IPA. The aroma is really kicking out a nice amount of kind of sweet, peachy kind of stone fruit, but there's quite a bit of mango in there as well. So you're getting some kind of like dank tropical notes, probably from the heavy use of Mosaic. It's very inviting, so let's go in for a taste. So yeah, there's a really thick kind of creamy mouthfeel on this beer. When we had the Lallemand guys on the pod, there was a lot of talk about lactone production with this yeast, which can give it a kind of creamy, almost coconut-like flavour or mouthfeel as well to the beer. I do feel like that is kind of present in this one. And yeah, just again, bags of tropical fruit. There's a real nice kind of bright citrus note in there, but then you've got the kind of like dank tropical mango. There's that sort of sweaty mango thing from the Mosaic. So it's produced a really nice beer. I'm really happy with how it came out. The fermentation was straightforward, fast, easy to manage, and didn't seem to cause any issues in terms of off flavours or anything like that, as I mentioned. That said, without a side-by-side comparison, it's always going to be difficult to say what the yeast is really bringing, particularly in beers like this, which are so heavily hopped anyway, because I guess maybe if the yeast is producing a bunch of esters, they're going to need to be pretty, intense for you to be able to distinguish them from the hops. So yeah, without a side-by-side comparison against another yeast, it's kind of difficult to say exactly what differences there are, if there are any, in fact. But the beer is delicious and really good, so I can't knock it in that sense. What I can say is there's definitely, for me, a distinct difference in terms of the fermentation performance over some of those other yeasts that I've mentioned. In fact, a measurable difference, I would say. So I think it's definitely faster than London Ale Free, which is a great yeast. I would use that generally as my go-to option. Verdant is very similar in terms of timescale to that, because it's kind of derived from that. I do find Verdant to be a bit more of a fussy sort of yeast strains. So I have had issues in the past with Verdant maybe not quite fermenting down to the target gravity. For me, it has stopped in the sort of low to mid 20s a few times rather than fermenting down below that. So this would maybe be a good choice for me in terms of a reliable yeast to use for those higher gravity beers where maybe other yeast might struggle to, you know, get you down to the required final gravity to hit your target ABV and so on. And it is going to do that in a pretty quick turnaround time. Quake is an option, obviously, in that sense. Some of the newer Quake strains I quite like. A lot of the other ones I haven't really got on with in the past, and I know some brewers don't really like Quake strains as a general rule. Some people just get flavours from them that they don't find particularly pleasant. I think this is, to me, it seems like this is trying to sort of bridge that gap between the faster turnaround, high attenuation kind of yeast, but something that isn't from a Quake isolate. So perhaps that's, you know, part of the kind of target in terms of marketing for this. I don't know. We'll see. So just coming back to the podcast, I mentioned that we tried a range of different beers on that podcast episode, and we tried different styles as well. So we had a West Coast IPA, a hoppy lager, a sort of standard strength hazy IPA, and then this double IPA as well. As you would expect, it was great in both of the hazy beers. They were really nice. Both came out well, delivered, you know, on the flavour as this beer has. With the other two styles and sort of across the beers generally, I would say we didn't really see an obvious kind of consistent flavour profile from the yeast that was really kind of clear and distinct. In fact, to an extent, it seemed a little bit almost neutral in the West Coast beer and the lager, or the lager style beer, because obviously it wasn't a lager yeast. We'll not say any more about that. But yeah, so that was obviously just a sort of one-off experiment. You don't want to take too much from that, but it might be the case that the kind of biotransformation potential of the work, which may not have been that high in those particular beers because of the way the beers were brewed and the hop choices in particular, that might be quite an important, you know, thing for this yeast in order to deliver its potential. So I would probably say, you know, it might be worth looking into the resources that Lallemand provide in terms of how to maximize biotransformation and which hops will be best for that and so on and so forth, if you want to make sure that you do maximize the impact of this particular yeast strain. So I feel like, yeah, perhaps the biotransformation effects from it are quite a big factor in the flavor that you get out of it at the end, just based on that little experiment that we did on the podcast. But go and watch or have a listen to it and you can find out more about that yourselves. So if you want to sample some commercial beers available in the UK that have actually been brewed with Pomona yeast, Alex from Lallemand very kindly sent me a list of beers that have been brewed with this strain. So I'll put a list of those up on the screen. If they are actually easily available still when this video comes out, I'll put some links to them in the description as well. But yeah, hopefully some of those might still be around in the shops or from the breweries themselves, and you can go and check those out if you want to have a little sample of something made with this strain before you dive into brewing with it for yourself. Okay guys, so that was Pomona yeast. Let me know what you think, if you've used it before or whether it sounds like a strain that you would be interested in. I think there's definitely some big positives in terms of what this yeast can do for you compared to some of the other options that are available, certainly in terms of kind of dry yeast options that are around at the moment. And yeah, I'd be interested to hear your feedback if you've brewed with it yourself. I think there's, like I said, a lot of positives for it. I think the jury's maybe out a little bit in terms of like how unique and distinctive the flavor profile from it is, but yeah, would need to do a side-by-side batch to really test that out properly. I think you could go and check out a video from the Oyster Boys if you want to see their verdict on that, because they did do it properly with a side-by-side. So I'll put a link to that up above if you want to go and check out their video. And if you found this useful, please remember to like, subscribe, chuck a comment in below, and yeah, just tune in next time. So cheers everybody, and see you on the next one.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness or Duder or, you know, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.